Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. It is a great pleasure to have you here in one of our most exciting webinars. So for those who are joining us for the first time, Smart Density organizes bi-weekly 30 minutes webinars that try to address relevant new topics related to architecture and urban planning. And we're trying to keep it to 30 minutes so our attendees can still take advantage of great and instructive discussion. I'm pretty sure it will be, and try to include a Q&A session at the very end. And for it to be as instructive as possible, we try to invite field specialists and speakers that can bring value to the conversation. And today we're extremely lucky to have two outstanding profiles, scholars and members of the Architects Against Housing Alienation collective, who worked on an exhibition called Not for Sale that is currently ongoing in Italy at the Canadian Pavilion of the Venice Biennale. And for those of you who have the chance to be there, it's still ongoing until November 26th. So please welcome Adrian and Sarah. Thank you for being with us today. I will start with a very brief introduction of our guests, and I really hope it does you justice. So Adrian Blackwell is currently an associate professor at the University of Waterloo, the School of Architecture, and has taught architecture and urbanism at Chongqing, Michigan, Toronto, and Harvard universities. Adrian is what we can call a man of many hats. So he's an artist, designer, theorist, and educator whose work explores the relationship between physical spaces and political economic forces. Adrian's work has been exhibited in different centers and public institutions across Canada, the US, and China, and focuses on the local and global effects of neoliberal urbanizations and the paradox of public space and private property. Thank you, Adrian. And Sarah Stevens is an architectural urban historian. So Sarah is an associate professor at the School of Architecture at UBC, University of British Columbia, and has previously taught in the schools of architecture at Rice, Columbia, Princeton, and Yale, which is quite expressive. And Sarah's research focuses on the link between architecture and capital, and she explores the cultural economy of architectural practice, finance, and expertise in both Canada and the US. A very interesting point while looking at Sarah's profile is that she's also in the board of directors of the Vancouver Urbanarium Society, where she recently co-chaired an international idea competition called the Mix in Middle, not the Missing Middle, and that asked for design proposals that challenge single-use zoning in residential areas. And it is very interesting for us as Smart Density has been doing a lot of work promoting and raising awareness about zoning issues and inherent problems to housing scarcity and the needs of what we call the missing middle. But the exposition we're going to be hearing about today seems to be taking a stronger stance. And this is what we're hoping to hear about today. So hopefully we're hoping to hear about the collective, how it was formed, how the team, and what's the story behind your nomination and for this exhibition. And before diving a little bit more into the core subject that is the Not for Sale exhibition. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohsin, and thanks, Nama and Smart Density for this invitation to this webinar. My name's Adrian Blackwell, and Mohsin's already done a great introduction. Thank you. I'm joining you today from the lands negotiated through Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit in Toronto. And I work in the Haldimand Tract, the lands promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. These are the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Attawandaron, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples.
And hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. Thanks for that great introduction, Moheen. As a white settler, I begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and stolen lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in the place settlers named Vancouver. This modern housing crisis that we'll be talking about today has its roots in settler colonial violence, and settler colonialism is a process that is ongoing and continues today. AHA is working to confront settler colonial practices of Indigenous land dispossession that lie at the foundation of spatial alienation today. So one piece of this project is a demand for land back. And so these maps of Canada depict this transformation that could come from certifying Crown land as Indigenous land. And so it's important for us as a kind of foundation to the whole of this project that we address the concerns from Indigenous communities calling for land back. The project was commissioned by the Canada Council for the Arts, and we're very grateful for all of their support, as well as the other sponsors, including the University of British Columbia's School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, University of Waterloo's School of Architecture, and the RAIC, the Ontario Association of Architects, the Architecture Foundation of British Columbia, and others. So lots of great supporters. To give a quick outline of what we'll cover today, I'm going to introduce the group, Architects Against Housing Alienation, and give an overview of the campaign and 10 demands that are the center of this project. Adrian will talk about the exhibition, and then we'll go back and forth talking about, in more depth, 3 of the demands that are part of the project: reparative architecture, a gentrification tax, and collective ownership. So Architects Against Housing Alienation is run by and founded from an organizing committee of 6 members. Adrian and I are 2 of those, but also includes David Forten, Matthew Souls, Lou Gigu, Patrick Stewart, and Tiana Vujosevic. We're also supported by a number of campaign collaborators who are key to the project: our graphic designer, Chris Lee, web designer, Ali Kadir, a campaign strategist, Vince Tao, and a film producer and editor, Maria Esperance Cerda. So our group really came together when the call went out for proposals to curate the Canada Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. The Architecture Biennale runs every other year, and the Canada Council for the Arts is the commissioner. So you can submit a proposal and go through a competitive process. We came together with a number of kind of overlapping and shared interests among the 6 of us, knowing that we would be able to put together a proposal for this that might be able to draw lots more attention to the conditions of housing in Canada. And we saw it as an opportunity on a few levels. We saw it as a chance to not just make this an exhibition that would live far away in Venice, but would also be leveraged for its maximum impact here in Canada. So we wanted to take this question, or the issue around housing in Canada, and give it an international presence, but we also wanted to bring it back. We wanted to involve as many people as we could in the project, to have as much kind of critical mass working on the exhibition, and also to help spread and advocate for change on the housing systems in Canada. I'm sure that the audience here knows that we have a problem with our housing systems here. And our group, AHA, really tries to as a foundation to the whole project, understands that the roots of this are in the exploitations that we see as inherent to both settler colonialism and to capitalism. And that foundation is from where we extend to this idea of housing alienation, that is our name, Architects Against Housing Alienation. That alienation is what we want to work against, and that we see decommodifying housing as a key piece to get us there. So we pulled together a number of teams, and we asked those teams to develop a demand. These are the kind of slogan versions of those short forms of demands. There are 10 teams. They were all asked to develop a proposal and a demand that we'll describe in more detail, that would try and counter the conditions of alienated housing that everyone experiences today. Each of the teams that we formed includes an activist, an advocate, and an architect. The idea being that architects probably have something to add to this conversation about housing, but maybe don't feel empowered to do so, but that activists have lots of on-the-ground experience and know where the problems are, and advocates have lots of research backing up from other disciplines and methodologies and understanding of the conditions and policy frameworks here. If we could pull these different and diverse kinds of expertise together, we could form really strong teams. We wanted those teams to come from across Canada, so we wanted geographic spread to be able to dive into specific problems in local areas that could also have some resonances across the whole country. And so these teams came together through our help to kind of matchmake and find the right activist, architect, and advocate for each team. And then they developed a proposed demand that would pull together these 10 demands, which together form our manifesto for the whole of the group. So each team develops a demand that has a long and a short and a medium form, and a project. And the projects, we ask them to have a financial and policy framework, an activist or campaign strategy, how would you get this done, and also an architectural design strategy. So we wanted it to work on multiple levels. We have 10 teams, and so I'm going to go through what those 10 teams and their short forms of their demands, and then we're going to dive in, as I said, to 3 teams in much more detail. So the first and most foundational demand for the project is land back. This demand was put forward by Sarah Silva, Patrick Stewart, and Chief Ian Campbell. Second team demands on the land housing. Cattleya Lafferty and Uri Scott developed this, thinking about off-grid housing for women in Indigenous communities in the North. The team looking at First Nations home building lodges is thinking about ways of building self-reliance within reserve communities in the prairies. And this team was comprised of One House Many Nations, David Forten, University of Manitoba, and a number of fantastic collaborators on this team. The reparative architecture team, based in Toronto's Little Jamaica neighborhood, was Keel Eglinton Residence, SOCA, and CP Planning, and we'll talk about them in more detail. A gentrification tax, this team, also based in Toronto, includes Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, LGA Partners, Gentrification Tax Action, and other partners. And then surplus properties for housing. This team is based in Halifax and comprises of Navigator Street Outreach Program, FBM Architecture, and the Affordable Housing Association of Nova Scotia. And they were looking at government-owned properties that could be used for housing and finding funding to build that housing through a mosaic strategy of pulling together existing funding in different programs. A team based in Toronto, this one is Intentional Communities for Unhoused People, and it's looking at transitional housing between tent encampments and permanent social housing, so cabin communities. And the team was Toronto Tiny Shelters, SVN Architects and Planners, and a Better Tent City Waterloo region. Collective ownership team, a West Coast based team looking at Richmond, south of Vancouver, and we'll talk about their proposal in more detail. This is Hex City Studio Architecture and Canadian Co-Housing Network. And a Montreal team here, Habitat Solidaire. This team is looking at mutual aid housing. So how can programs be mutually supportive and build community in a very robust way through those actions. And the team is comprised of the Tableau de Concentration du Faubourg Saint-Laurent, a number of other activist team members on this team, and Atelier Big City is the architect, and Ipek Torelli from McGill is the advocate. And finally, the team also in Montreal, Ambient Ecosystems Commons, looking at climate change and different urban systems as they overlay and overlap with housing needs, arguing that you can't have only a unit of housing, you need to have functioning urban systems that it is part of. And this team is the Center for Urban Ecology Montreal, Loaf Architects, and Bâtir Sans Quartier. And I will pass it now to Adrian to talk more about, oh no, I have one more piece. And also we have a campaign that this is part of. So the exhibition is one piece and it's an important piece, but we also see this as a broader campaign that we have launched with this exhibition. So we want to have events. We began with a series of more academic roundtables where we're trying to raise awareness with postering in cities. There are posters up in Ottawa right now. We have an online campaign through social media with an Instagram and TikTok account trying to spread the messages of these 10 teams and all of the work that they've been doing. And then we're planning more direct action and community workshops and other campaign activities that will take and deepen these demands and then also try and build further support to actually get change to happen. And now I'll hand it over to Adrian to talk about the exhibit.
So if you recall, Sarah showed an image of the Canadian Pavilion as it was after its renovation. You can see that right now in Venice, the pavilion looks very different. And it's covered in a hoarding, something like a construction hoarding. And on the hoarding are images of a tent village. Marie McGregor Pitawanakwat, who was the elder who inaugurated and introduced the opening ceremonies, said that this is an image of a village. And we thought it was important to put this village on the Canadian Pavilion, one, to show the condition of people who are most alienated from what we usually think of as housing in Canada, people who we think of as homeless. But Marie also pointed out that people living in these villages are working to disalienate their housing, and that the three forms of alienation that we've thought a lot about in this exhibition: alienation from the social communities that people live in, alienation from the ecological world that surrounds people, and alienation from people's own sense of agency and creativity in making their own housing. These tent villages illustrate people struggling and working in very proactive ways to overcome those forms of alienation. So we ask all visitors to enter through these images with the slogan "No Surrender" on the front, to kind of illustrate the urgency of the problem that we have in Canada. People then enter between and into the courtyard. Next slide. I should also say the hoarding, I should have described it in a little more detail, was not made by us from stills from the internet. It's made from stills that come from a video made by Ryan Sudds, working very closely with the Housing Solidarity Network in Vancouver. And so the images were really made in collaboration with people working in the communities. If you can go forward to the courtyard. So the courtyard, you enter this crystalline courtyard. The pavilion is a very beautiful building. And in the first thing you come to is what we call the land back courtyard. And so this was developed by the land back team. And it's essentially a kind of garden made like a blockade, but filled with plants which are grown in Italy, but which are species that resonate with plants of the West Coast. Most of them are the same species, even if they're a different variant of them growing in Europe. So this garden evokes the Pacific Northwest, where the Nisga'a people and Patrick Lugigi Stewart lives. And so from this courtyard, you look in through the glass and you can see the work of all the 10 teams. You can see the banners and all the 10 demands, but you also see a mezzanine. So there's a second floor, and on the second floor is an architecture studio filled with students working on the project. Next slide. So if you look at the project in section, we think of it as a set of layers, starting on the right-hand side with the hoarding, and then the courtyard, and then this glazed layer that gives you this kind of kaleidoscopic view, a panoramic kaleidoscopic view into the interior. And then we have a section where we show the work in detail of the 10 teams and the 10 demands. And then there's an area that's more of an open workspace. And on the far left side of the image is where the banners of the 10 demands sit. Next slide. So you can also see this in this exploded axonometric. So the Canadian Pavilion is actually designed on a Fibonacci series. It's like a snail shell. And we really worked with the geometry of the pavilion itself to create the mezzanine in the space. And the mezzanine on top holds the studio for 15 students plus faculty member. And underneath it creates a set of bays. And on each side of the bay is a different project. Next slide. So this is just a short walk through. This is on the land and First Nation home building lodges in the first bay. So the first thing you come to after land back are a couple of projects that focus on Indigenous housing issues. Next slide. And also in the pavilion, there are two kinds of banners. There are banners that the teams made, which include images of each of the 10 projects, and in very large font, a declaration of their demands. So in this image, you see reparative architecture on the left, but you also see up high First Nations home building lodges, a banner made by Gray Pitapan Muldoon, a Halifax-based artist who has been making banners that he calls banners for fugitives to commemorate his own evictions from places in Halifax. But here he made 10 unique banners to demand our 10 demands. Next slide. So you can see we have benches, furniture that can be moved around the space, tables that can be used for different events. And we also have a library in the space. Next slide. Some of the projects are actually shown on laptops. So each of the demands has a wall, but some of them also have videos associated with them that were made for the project, introducing issues of homelessness in Indigenous communities and in urban communities. Next slide. Here you see up into the workspace of the students, which is very beautifully lit from the courtyard. Next slide. And then a view back, and maybe next slide. We'll move more quickly through these images of the space. This is one of the this is the exit, but at the entrance and the exit, we have campaign materials. At the entrance, we didn't show it, but there's a map that shows the locations of all the projects. And at the exit, there's a calendar that shows upcoming events and the progress of the campaign. And on the right-hand side in this image, we have the Atlas of Housing Alienation, which gives a context to the projects. It gives a historical context to the kinds of problems that exist in Canadian housing and traces the continuity between settler colonialism and contemporary housing issues. Next slide. And this is just a view from on top of the mezzanine. Next slide. And I think that's the last one of the pavilion. Next slide. Okay, and here you can see the land back courtyard in action with the full class of students from UBC doing a seminar. So we did think about the courtyard both as a symbolic space, but also a really active space in the heart of the pavilion. Next slide. So I'm going to go through two demands relatively quickly. So there's an amazing team that Sarah's already introduced, working in Little Jamaica, Keele Eglinton Residence, SOCA, and CP Planning. And they demand a reparative architecture for Black residents of Toronto's Little Jamaica who have been displaced over the last decades, and in an accelerated way with the production of a new LRT system. So much of the displacement they see as state-led gentrification. And you can see there's been a lot of organizing, not just by these teams, but also by Black Urbanism Toronto, Jay Pitter, and many other people in the city of Toronto, but including the groups that are part of this project here, to rally the community and ask for reparations from the city of Toronto. Next slide. So they see reparations, reparative architecture and reparative planning as requiring a few stages of work. So first, there is the harm, and then there needs to be acknowledgement, and then accountability, and then forms of restoration. Next slide. And one of the fundamental forms of restoration they are arguing for is a community land trust that can create equitable, affordable, and flexible forms of development. Next slide. And I think this project is very interesting in relation to questions of density in the city of Toronto. So it's one of the projects in the 10 that deals with the missing middle. And one of the things that SOCA has really been advocating for is different programs. So a mixed program form of missing middle. So here they're thinking about retail both on Eglinton, in the lane behind Eglinton, but also quiet retail on residential streets. The other thing that's interesting about this is that they really see they see one problem in the missing middle strategy is that it doesn't address cultural needs and mixed uses sufficiently. The other thing they critique is main streets zoning and mid-rise guidelines. And so one of the things they see on the LRT is very large buildings destroying all the at-grade retail. And so they're interested both in the densification of existing buildings to retain the retail spaces, but also thinking about single lot mid-rise. So thinking about how development could be more granular. Next slide. And you see that in these images where they've explained the kind of life they want to create. And they think that that life is tied to a certain granularity of density. Next slide. And the final slide here shows this kind of great diversity of buildings that creates a diversity of occupation and life in the city streets. Next slide. So We Demand a Gentrification Tax is three or four primary partners. LGA Architectural Partners with Tough Lab from University of Toronto, and the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust and Gentrification Tax Action. And together they're proposing a tax that would be on the increase in the value of a home that would decline over time. It would be hypothecated and be used to build deeply affordable, locally managed housing in a specific neighborhood. So by hypothecated, I mean earmarked, both in terms of its function and in terms of its location. That is, it would be collected at the ward level, much like a community benefits agreement would be, or what used to be called Section 37. Next slide. That was just our the gentrification tax website that allows you to calculate how much you would have to pay. This is a drawing by Levitt Goodman Architects that looks at Jameson Avenue in Parkdale, and Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust has been acquiring buildings in Parkdale. It now has quite a large number of buildings, not all in Parkdale, because of the recent downloading of buildings from the City of Toronto to different land trusts in the city. But they've acquired rooming houses, and they did a study looking at the problem around the disappearance of rooming houses in Parkdale. And now they've done a really powerful study about the problems related to rental apartment buildings in Parkdale. Next slide. And they point out that what's happened to most rental apartment buildings in Parkdale is that they've been bought up by real estate investment trusts. And so they really posit the land trust as a radical community-based alternative to the real estate investment trust. The real estate investment trust comes in with one mandate, which is to raise rents in order to satisfy its investors. The land trust has an opposite mandate, which is to keep units affordable and at a low rent. And so Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust is interested in buying these through the multi-unit residential acquisition fund that the city is setting up. Next slide. But we think you need bigger income streams to do this. I think the city has something like $50 million allocated for the Mura project. But in order to really create affordability in the city, we need new income streams. And so the gentrification tax is a way to radically increase the housing budget of the city, which is the only way that we believe affordability is possible in a city like Toronto. Next slide. So Levitt Goodman Architects looked at this existing building, which is typical of buildings, mid-rise buildings along Jameson, which were built in the 50s and 60s, and looks at layering the front of the building, expanding the building, an addition on the front, an addition on the top, and changing the courtyard to kind of change the whole nature of the housing as they show in this diagram. Next slide. And I think the section that you see here gives a very clear impression of the types of changes they see that would radically transform this housing by making it more suitable for the kinds of larger families who are currently living in it, but also more environmentally sustainable and increase the number of units, affordable units in the neighborhood.
Okay, I will take over and talk about the last of the 3 projects we're going into some detail on. So this is the collective ownership team based on the West Coast and the Lower Mainland. So not Vancouver, but looking south to the city of Richmond. And so their proposal, this little diagram on the right, describes that they're interested in co-op, as in cooperative housing as a form of tenure, interested in co-living as a kind of community, a different approach to building community, and then co-housing as a different approach to like housing typologies. So they're thinking of these different formats of co, and so this co phrase became COCOMO, trying to reimagine housing. And they're looking at, really how do you imagine all these different forms of collectivity, and how do you both communicate this to a broader public, but also think about the kind of barriers to get these types of projects built in the world. So they developed what they called a glossary of co, describing what co-housing is, what co-living is, cooperative housing, and what co-design is. So they're thinking also about the design process and how that tends to unfold. And then they're thinking about different regulatory approaches and different financial approaches. So how do you talk to cities and municipalities and provincial governments about the policies that would need to be changed in order to build more housing of this type? And how do you talk to mortgage lenders who have all kinds of barriers that make it quite difficult to get mortgages and construction loans to build new cooperative or co-ownership formats for housing, with the ultimate goal of trying to push for a much higher percentage of non-market housing within the broader spectrum of housing in the region. So they're working in the city of Richmond, which they analyze and try to understand the history of Richmond as a kind of garden city format, very originally settlements of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples of First Nations, and then settled by colonizers into a kind of agricultural zone, low-rise residential, eventually urbanizing into a sort of garden city format that was primarily a landscape of single-family homes on relatively large lots that were broken down from these larger size agricultural plots. Richmond is also an ethnoburb, so it's got a lot of high population of people of Asian descent, East Asian descent especially, that live there. And so it's culturally quite unique, and the housing that exists doesn't necessarily respond to those cultural norms. And so the project was also thinking about how can housing be more responsive to that particular ethnoburb culture. And then co-design, they were thinking about how do you imagine participatory design for something like more kind of collective forms of housing. So they are analyzing what this co-design process would look like. They're analyzing how would you go through and find the development financing to build something like this? Where would the land costs be? How would the fees for permitting and construction costs and such go? Architects' fees, but then also the construction costs. And how would that be broken down across a number of different residents who might be moving into something like this? And how would the mortgaging eventually work? And then thinking also about the household economics. So how would you imagine if this household is going to include lots of different configurations of family types moving in together? How would those groups come together to imagine how the monthly expenses would be covered, how the housing contributions would be made to create this kind of community? And so working on a single lot in Richmond, so just a single family home lot, and imagining a change to the zoning that would allow for a more denser and missing middle scale of density for housing on this site. They proposed this new project that would, I think, include 30 or 40 people. I can't remember exactly what the total number of residents would be from the typical 2 to 4 people who might live on a single family lot. So very much part of this missing middle conversation about how do you bring gentler forms of density into single family neighborhoods. And in these beautiful kind of triptych drawings that they created, they were trying to understand like how would these co-housing formats respond to different kinds of needs that people might have and provide different forms for community life within this single family lot. So kind of like creating a kind of urbanized life within this. So these kind of cartoon diagrams play out like, how are people connecting with one another? How are they helping each other out? You know, where's the kind of mutual aid that's happening here? How are people finding their way to be part of such a community? So they develop these as part of their co-design process. They develop these kind of characters based on people that they knew to try to play act their way through imagining who might live here and what it might be like to live here, and what different people would contribute and what different people would receive from this experience of living here together. So these drawings, I think, are a really fun way that's also quite useful as a tool for explaining to a broader public, like what are the benefits of this style of housing. So we have more within the larger scope of the whole of the project for Architects Against Housing Alienation. I think their project really is looking to think about how would the general public want to engage in their units of housing, and how could they start to see themselves inside something that doesn't look like the normal offerings of the housing market as it stands, but could provide and convince them to be part of something that's maybe somewhat different. So I know we're out of time, so I'm going to conclude really quickly. I know this was a bit of a rush through a lot of material. We had over 100 people contributing to all of these projects, over 45 organizations that were part of these designs and work. Adrian and I are just, you know, a tiny, tiny piece of a lot of work that went into this. And I think we see that this campaign to end housing alienation that we're working on is very broad, but also pretty deep. You can go into these projects and find that there's a lot there. And we don't see the exhibition in Venice as its end. We're really hoping that this continues, that we can continue the advocacy and the push to change to decommodify housing in Canada. So if you click on, or if you screen grab whatever, a picture of this QR code, you can get to our Instagram, and that'll also link you to our website and TikTok accounts. So stay connected. Moheen, do we have time for
Amazing.
questions?
I meant to ask, actually, because I know I see the amount of subjects that are tackled in your presentations, and I only can see potential webinars about each one of these projects because of the importance of all the matters that they refer to. And a couple of questions really quick, because I'm pretty sure most of the attendees will be very interested, and as I am, to know more and read more about it. So are there any incoming publications, books or magazines or something where we can read more about it? And the second question would be, are there any upcoming events as well that maybe you can hear of on Instagram or TikTok, or that we could benefit of?
Upcoming, well, publications, we don't have plans for a book right now, but that's always a possibility for further into the future. There's been a fair amount of press coverage and some a CBC Arts article yesterday that really did a great job of capturing the spirit of the campaign. The website has a fair amount of information about the team, so anybody who wants to learn more and read more can go onto the website, see more of the images of the work from the teams, and read the team's own descriptions about their projects. So there's lots of material to be had there. Adrian, do you have anything else to suggest that I'm missing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think events are something that we're actively working on right now. I mean, I think we put a lot of energy into the physical exhibition and the broadsheet that we produce. So there is actually a broadsheet. The problem is, but is it downloadable on the website? Not yet. Okay, but it should be. But it really has the same content as the website, but it's just a different format. But at the moment, we're working hard on how to move forward each of these campaigns, and there will be events associated with each of them. So we'll have to keep you posted, or you'll have to keep yourselves posted through the website. I mean, the website is really the best place, and the social media will have announcements.
Yeah, and there's a place on the website you can sign up to join the campaign. You can kind of put your email address in, and when we have events that are local to where you are, you'll get a notification, an email that tells you what's happening. Okay, this is great. Unfortunately, I can't take any more questions, but thank you so much. It was one of the most exciting webinars I've had to attend, and thank you so much. I hope to hear from you soon. And
thank you, Masim.
Have a great day. Bye-bye. Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for attending.
Joining.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.